Okay, by my watch and my laptop clock, it is 2 p.m., so I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Townsend, and I am the director of the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled Congressional Oversight Databases, which the Levin Center is hosting in partnership with the Wayne Law Review. Thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone in attendance today is staying healthy and safe in the extremely challenging times we are experiencing. I'm going to briefly describe the Levin Center and why today's conference and the databases we will discuss are so important to our work, and we think exciting to many of us who believe oversight is a research topic that holds great promise for expanding our understanding of democracy and policymaking. Now, databases and excitement are not words you often hear uttered in the same sentence, but if you are an oversight scholar or a practitioner, or someone who just cares about rebuilding the norms of bipartisan fact-finding, the databases our panelists have to share may be genuinely exciting. Or, let's face it, if like many of us, you have barely left your house in the last 2 months, your standards for what constitutes excitement may have changed a bit. Now, a word about the Levin Center. Former Senator Carl Levin founded the Levin Center in 2015 upon his retirement from the United States Senate, where he served for 36 years. The Levin Center is headquartered at Wayne State University Law School and also has a Washington, D.C. office. Our mission is to advance bipartisan, fact-based oversight and civil discourse as instruments of change. Today, we are gathered to do both of those things, to engage in some civil discourse about databases that can advance our understanding of congressional oversight. In the past few years, the Levin Center, with our partners at the Luger Center and the Project on Government Oversight, have trained hundreds of congressional staff in techniques of bipartisan fact-based oversight, and we have begun to bring that training to state lawmakers as well. We also support and conduct research on important oversight topics and maintain an oversight listserv that many with us today contribute to. And finally, we also advocate for the right of the legislative branch to conduct oversight and for the vigorous use of that power by Congress and state legislatures to ensure transparency and accountability in government. We originally envisioned this gathering to be the third panel in an in-person conference on technology and congressional oversight that the Levin Center and the Wayne Law Review had planned to host on March 20th of this year at the law school. That event, of course, had to be postponed due to the pandemic. And rather than wait until in-person conferences become possible, we offer today's panel on congressional oversight databases. We are also considering holding online versions of the other two panels from our symposium, and we'll be back in touch about those plans. So why do these databases matter? Our moderators and panelists will have a lot to say about this, but from the Levin Center's perspective, just let me say that these resources for deepening our understanding of congressional oversight could not have come at a more opportune time. At a time when Congress is locked in an unprecedented struggle with the current administration to obtain the information it needs to hold the executive branch accountable. When Congress simultaneously is authorizing previously unimaginable levels of spending to respond to a pandemic that threatens us all, and when the public's faith in the federal government is at an all-time low, impeding our ability to unite in an effective response to the pandemic. When all these things are going on, congressional oversight must play a central role in ensuring government accountability and transparency and in redeeming the public's faith in self-government. But it can only do so if people grasp its importance, if they understand the state of oversight in Congress, and if they insist that Congress live up to its responsibilities to conduct oversight. Franklin Delano Roosevelt once told a group of civil rights leaders seeking his help, quote, "I agree with you, I want to do it, now make me do it," unquote. The public will only make Congress do its oversight duty if it has the data necessary for understanding oversight and how well or how poorly oversight is being conducted. Today, we will hear about three remarkable resources for advancing that understanding, databases that we hope many of you here today will use to study congressional oversight and greater understanding. Before I turn things over to Will Broman from the Wayne Law Review, I want to thank a few people here who have been instrumental in putting this event together. First, former Wayne Law Symposium editor Megan Dreyer, who is now a Wayne Law graduate, worked very hard with the Levin Center staff to put together the entire three-panel conference originally set for March 20th. The current Wayne Law Symposium editor, Will Broman, from whom you will hear in a moment, for his work on this panel. And also I want to thank the Wayne Law Review editor, Kylie O'Brien, as well as the rest of the editorial staff for their help in making this panel possible. And finally, at the Levin Center, having this online panel was the brainchild of our Washington office co-director, Elise Bean, who did a tremendous amount of work putting together the entire symposium lineup, and without whom this event would not have been possible. And I also want to thank Emily Van Bar and Suba Paramal from our staff for their fine efforts in working with our panelists and partners to create this online experience and to let the world know about it. So with that, I will turn things over to Will Broman of the Wayne Law Review, and thank you.
Thanks, Jim. The Wayne Law Review is excited to host everybody today alongside the Levin Center. And on behalf of the Law Review, Wayne State University Law School, and the school as a whole, we thank everybody for tuning in and welcome you to this lively discussion that we're about to have on government oversight. I too want to thank last year's symposium editor, Megan Dreyer, and editor-in-chief, Shelby Rose, for their work establishing the entire symposium that had to have been postponed, as well as Kylie O'Brien, this year's editor-in-chief, and the remainder of our editorial board and editorial staff. I'm excited that we have scholars from the Brookings Institution, the Luger Center, and University of Tampa to discuss these very timely issues. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, director of the Radcliffe Institute and Harvard professor, Dan Carpenter.
Greetings, everybody. I just want to say, first off, it's an honor and a privilege to appear here today. First off, as a fellow Michigander of origin, on behalf of the Levin Center, which occupies a really unique and important place in the conversation, and as Jim mentioned, the increasingly vital conversation about congressional oversight. The Levin Center has been running events, symposia, discussions, using the Wayne Law Review in collaboration with the review to really advance the conversation. And I urge everybody who's a part of this event today to keep your eye on what's going on at the Levin Center. It's a really, really important public service that they have created there. Just 2 points before I introduce our fantastic panel. First, I just want to remind everybody that oversight is fundamental to our system of separated powers and to the rule of law. Our system of government from the founding and even well before rests not merely on the separation of powers, but in part the mixture of powers. The small role that the executive sometimes plays in legislation, the role that the legislature can play in the execution of legislation. And legislative oversight has been there from the very, very beginning of the Republic. And in any world where we care about the rule of law, congressional oversight, legislative oversight is absolutely essential to make sure that the people's statutory intent, the statutory intent of those elected by the people, and those laws that have made their way through our system of separated powers is in fact being implemented in administration and execution. But it's also important for the value that what we talk about, fundamental value that we talk about in our democratic republic, and that is accountability. We often say, well, people need to be held accountable for their actions, but that means not merely paying a penalty, but also actually literally giving an account. So what is the story behind how a law has been enforced and implemented? Do those who enforce and implement those laws have to answer to anyone in person with a story, with their own account as to the actions that they have taken and that they have not taken? The databases that you're going to see today, along with others, represent many years, in some cases, decades of work. And they give us a more systematic view of these accounts across policy issues, across bills, and across time than ever before. And with that, it's my privilege to introduce our three panelists today. First, Jamie Spitz, who is Assistant Director of the Bipartisan Governance at the Luger Center. And she's going to talk about the Luger Center's exciting 10-year database of oversight hearings, congressional oversight hearings, which has just been released. It coincides with today's event. Jamie holds a degree in policy analysis from Indiana University's Kelley School of Business, and also a certificate in applied research from Indiana University's School of Public and Environmental Affairs. We're thrilled to have her with us here today. After her will be Molly Reynolds of the Brookings Institution, and she's going to be talking about its new real-time oversight tracker. Dr. Reynolds got her PhD in political science and public policy from the University of Michigan after getting her undergraduate degree from Smith in government. And she is the author of a really great book that I can't recommend enough to everybody. It's called Exceptions to the Rule: The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the US Senate, with Brookings University Press. And finally, after Molly will appear Jonathan Llewellyn of the University of Tampa. He's going to be talking about the long-standing University of Texas collection of congressional hearings. Professor Llewellyn received his PhD in political science from the University of Texas in 2017. And he has been absolutely centrally involved in the Comparative Policy Agendas project in recent years, which represents really a mammoth undertaking in the history of political science. And it is in part due to people like Jonathan Llewellyn that really vital undertaking is continuing and being brought up to date. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jamie Spitz. Jamie, tell us about your new database.
Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction, Dan. And like Dan said, I'm here from the Luger Center to present our brand new Congressional Oversight Hearing Index. This is the first day that we've launched it, so you are among the first people to see it, and we're very excited to share this new database. If you're interested, you can find it at oversight-index.lugercenter.org. But I'll go ahead and jump in. So Suba, if you don't mind switching to the next slide. So what is the Congressional Oversight Hearing Index? Well, it's an analytical tool that people can use to assess the oversight performance of each congressional committee. And we've done this by taking 12 years worth of congressional hearings, almost 20,000 congressional hearings, that we have consistently and objectively categorized based on their relevance to oversight. And then from these categorizations, we've derived grades that we've assigned, letter grades that we've assigned to committees to basically evaluate their oversight performance. So during this presentation today, I'll first kind of take you through the theory behind this project. Then I'll explain our data and methodology. And then finally, I'll explain what this tool actually does and how you can use it. So moving on to the next slide. If you're here today, if you're listening to this conversation, you're probably of the mind that oversight is really important for all of the reasons that Dan and Jim have already said, for ensuring co-equal branches of government, for providing checks and balances. And this lack of congressional oversight reduces government efficiency and expands unchecked executive power. The problem is that to this point, no standards or norms have really been established for what is normal for oversight. So there's not really a collective understanding to hold legislators accountable. And so committee chairs can use anecdotal evidence to point to to support their claims that they're performing adequate oversight when in reality, they might not be. So our solution, moving on to the next slide, is to construct an objective standard for each committee's oversight performance based on historical norms. And like I said, we've done that by collecting 12 years worth of congressional hearings that we've sorted into categories based on their relationship to oversight. And this has allowed us to better understand which committees are dedicating the time to oversight. And we hope that people will use this tool to hold legislators accountable for performing their duties. So moving on to the next slide, one of the biggest challenges that we faced in creating this project was figuring out how to construct an objective standard. We knew that we wanted something that was objective and quantifiable, kind of similar to our bipartisan index that we put out every year. So the first question that we needed to answer was, what data did we want to use as part of creating this standard? And there are many ways, many levers that Congress can use to conduct oversight. Molly will talk to you today about letters. I think Jonathan will talk a little bit about congressional reports. But we've observed that most cases of significant oversight involve or are accompanied by congressional hearings. And so we've chosen to only study congressional hearings as kind of a proxy to understand oversight. The second question that we needed to answer was, how do we determine historical norms? Every committee in Congress has different oversight responsibilities, and they also have different capabilities based on their staff sizes and their budgets. And so it's kind of impossible to compare the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with EPW. So we have created a historical standard for each committee where we're comparing chairman to historical chairman in that committee. So moving on, I've mentioned a couple of times that we have sorted all of these 20,000 hearings into different oversight categories. And I won't go through all of these today, but basically they range from hearings with really intense investigative content where the committee is investigating a failure or a malfeasance within either a federal agency or the private sector, all the way down to more information gathering hearings where a committee might be bringing in someone from Brookings or the University of Tampa to talk about a certain topic. And then within each of these categories, we've given these hearings, a certain weight. We've quantified them to understand, how much oversight content is within each of these hearings. So moving to the next slide, we took all of these weights and actually turned it into a score. So these hearings that we've now quantified, we were able to score each committee within each congressional session based on their oversight content. And then from these scores, we were able to compare each committee to historical committees. So the chairman with the best score will get an A, and then every chairman after that will be compared to that best score. And that's kind of the standard to beat. So what's actually on this Congressional Oversight Hearing Index? Well, moving on to the next slide, the first thing that you'll see when you open the website is all of these grades for each committee. So you'll see an evaluation of each committee along with the chairman, and then the number of hearings that have been held so far within each of those categories that I mentioned. And then if you click into a committee, moving on to the next slide, you'll be able to see a projected grade for this Congress, along with a narrative that we've written that explains the committee's oversight responsibilities, as well as the committee's oversight history, just to kind of give the reader an overview of what that committee does in terms of oversight. And then further down the page, on the next slide, you'll see that we have current oversight performance metrics along with historical oversight performance. And that you can see that on the next slide if we're able to get there. Yeah, so there's going to be a grade for each congressional session within each committee. So you can see historical performance. And we think that this is a really valuable tool for people to go and view, historical oversight content for each committee. And then finally, at the bottom of each committee, you'll also see hearings that are listed for the last 12 years, and that's posted on the next slide. Yeah, so you'll see hearings that have been held in the last 12 years, and you'll see how we've categorized them. And then if you click into that hearing, you'll also have access to transcripts and videos, as well as committee chair statements and ranking member statements. So this is a great database, a great resource for people studying oversight, as well as a great resource for anyone just wanting to understand more about congressional hearings. So if you have any more questions, please visit our website at oversight-index.thelugercenter.org. And then we're also going to be having our own tutorial and Q&A session next Tuesday. So you can go ahead and sign up for that if you don't get a chance to ask your question today. So like I said, we're really excited to present this to the world, really excited to be here today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Molly.
Before Molly begins, let me just remind the audience that you can use the Q&A feature of Zoom to pose questions of our panelists, and I will curate those and pose them to the panelists later on. Thank you very much, Jamie, for that fantastic presentation, and take it away, Molly.
All right, thank you, Dan. Thank you to everyone at the Levin Center for moving this panel online and for having us for this important conversation today. So I'm going to talk about a project that we have been working on at Brookings for the past about 18 months since the beginning of the current Congress, called the Brookings House Oversight Tracker. And if we can go to the next slide. We'll see that for us, this project really has two goals. One involves its genesis during the 2018 midterm election campaign. And at that point, we were seeing a lot of news stories about how if Democrats took control of the House of Representatives after the 2018 midterms, that they would pursue really aggressive oversight of the Trump administration. We also know from scholarly work that we should see Congress doing more investigations under divided party control, where one party controls one or both chambers of Congress and a different party controls the White House. So those were one set of expectations. But when we looked at the actual conduct of congressional campaigns in 2018, they weren't really about Trump. They weren't really about the president. If you look, for example, at advertising data on what television advertisements talked about during the 2018 midterms, we saw the most common topic of those ads was not the executive branch, was not President Trump, but they were about healthcare. If you compare television ads from 2018 to those from midterms in 2006, in 2010, in 2014, we saw fewer mentions of President Trump than we saw of President George W. Bush or President Obama. So one thing we wanted to be able to do was see which one of these storylines really played out in the 116th Congress. Did we see a lot of oversight, or did we see Congress doing things that were actually less focused on the president and the conduct of the executive branch? We also wanted to be able to create a resource that was going to be useful for a broad audience. Journalists, the public, but also for academic researchers, particularly people who might want to be able to use really detailed data about a single Congress, which is what our tracker looks at, to examine theories of congressional behavior. So if we want to go to the next slide, I'm going to sort of walk through now how our tracker works. So what do we track? We track two things. One, we track letters that are sent by House committees or subcommittees, and that are signed by the subcommittee or committee chair. Here, this is an important distinction because we know that the minority party in Congress really doesn't have the same institutional power to engage in oversight that the majority party does, nor do individual members of Congress. And so we're really here looking at the actions of congressional committees, letters that the committees in the House are sending. And we also look at hearings. So Jamie talked about hearings. I think Jonathan's going to talk about hearings as well. But again, we also look at hearings held by House committees and subcommittees. The next slide, please. So how do we do this? The first step in this process is to gather information on all of the hearings conducted by committees in the House and to the extent that we can, all of the letters sent on behalf of those committees. And we do this in two ways. So for letters, importantly, congressional committees are not required to release the letters. They do not have to post them online. So we are somewhat here at the mercy of what congressional committees choose to release. I can say that there are relatively few letters that we become aware of in other ways, whether they be through news reports or what have you, that have not been released publicly. But basically here we are at the mercy of what congressional committees post on their websites. And we have my research team goes and visits the websites of House committees every week to pull down these letters. And then for hearings, we've developed a web scraper that automates this process somewhat and uses the House of Representatives committee calendar that is part of the House's website to gather information on the committee, the title of the hearing, the witnesses, so on and so forth. Next slide. So from all of this data, we then have to make a determination about what qualifies as oversight of the executive branch. And so we do this by having developed a two-tiered strategy based on keywords and key witnesses. So we have a set of sort of primary keywords and witnesses where if those appear in the title of a hearing, in the letter, that those qualify as oversight. And so some of the primary keywords that we use are things like oversight, investigate, accountability, that sort of thing. We also have a set of primary witnesses. So things like if someone is from the Government Accountability Office, if we have an agency inspector general, that sort of thing. And then if this standard is met, there are a couple other conditions that we also say have to be true for something to qualify as oversight of the executive branch for our purpose. So we're again interested in things that the executive branch has been doing since Election Day 2016. So there's a set of behaviors that happened during, say, the 2016 presidential campaign that are outside the scope of what we're looking at. And again, it really must focus on the federal government as the target of the oversight, as opposed to, say, a legislative proposal or a state government. Next slide. There's also a second set of keywords and witness identities, letter recipients that we have identified. And these, if these are present in a piece of potential oversight content, we subject things to a little bit of a higher scrutiny. So things like words like update and the effects of a policy. Here we look for witnesses or letter recipients who are the heads of agencies or agency subunits, individuals who might have knowledge of executive branch operations. And again, some of this material will fall under the category of oversight and some of it won't. Every piece of potential oversight content, whether it's a hearing or a letter, for us is reviewed by two independent coders working separately, with then a third person coming in to adjudicate any disagreements between our coders as to whether something is oversight or not. Next slide. So you might be curious sort of how this compares to both some of the other data that we're hearing about today, as well as other data sources beyond the scope of this panel. So Jamie put up before her slide that shows the sort of spectrum of oversight activity that the folks at the Luger Center have been tracking. Because we are focused really on oversight of the executive branch, what we're capturing would sort of fall into some of the categories that Jamie described. So their agency conduct category, for example. There are some things in the policy hearing category that will come up in our tracker. And then within their legislative hearings category, we look at agency budget request hearings, since those are, I think, an important place where oversight happens. Jonathan is going to talk about the Policy Agendas Project in a little bit, which categorizes a really wide range of content in American politics into different policy areas. There are 20 of them. We use the same coding scheme to categorize each letter and each hearing into a policy area. Again, we use those same 20 for our web interactive, which I'll show you a screenshot from in a minute. We collapse those 20 into 10 just to sort of streamline things a little bit, but the underlying content is all coded according to those 20 policy areas. We track what committees are sending the letters or holding hearings. To do that, we use the same numeric coding system that was developed for committees for the Vital Statistics on Congress project, which is also run out of Brookings. So if someone wanted to take the data that we have on oversight and compare it to other data on congressional committees that Vital Statistics tracks, you would be able to do that quite easily. And the same is true for agencies. If an agency is a recipient of a letter, or if a witness in a hearing is from an agency, we use the standard OMB and Department of Treasury numeric codes for those agencies and bureaus. So if someone wanted to compare our data to other data that uses those same identifiers, again, we've set it up to be able to do that easily. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk, here is just a preview of what the interactive looks like on the web. So you can see there the 10 different sort of policy area buckets that we track letters and hearings within. And then you can see that for each piece of oversight content, you can, if you were to click on that text in red, you would be able to see who the recipient of the letter was. In this case, the director of the U.S. Marshal Service. Under that, you can see who signed the letter. In this case, it's Jerry Nadler, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Karen Bass, who's the chair of one of Judiciary's subcommittees. You'll be able to click and get a copy of the letter, and so on and so on. And so now, just to close, can we go to the next slide? Just tell you a little bit about some of what we learned about oversight in the first year of the 116th Congress, so in calendar year 2019. So this is a graph that looks by month from January to, this actually goes through, through April of 2020, sorry. So we have the first year and a half of the 116th Congress. And so here you can see of all of the hearings that were held in the House during the 116th Congress, what share of them in each month were oversight hearings. And so you can see that in some months that was higher. So between about May and December of 2019, about a quarter of hearings each month tended to be oversight. And then in other months, it was lower. And so hearings, as Jamie was saying, certainly are a really important tool of congressional oversight. But as we'll see on the next slide, letters in the 116th Congress, a greater share of letters sent by committees were oversight than, say, of hearings held. So here we see that at least 45% of letters sent each month met our definition of oversight. And this might reflect a couple of things. So one, it might reflect the fact that letters can actually be more effective than hearings in some situations at actually getting new information. Some of this is because of hearing formats. Some of it also has to do with the fact that the Trump administration has often been unwilling to cooperate with requests for witness testimony and has indicated a willingness to really fight very hard on compliance with congressional subpoenas. So we heard the the Supreme Court last week heard a case about this very topic. And so, and at the very least, the administration has been willing to consume a lot of time in negotiations with Congress about trying to get individuals to testify. So that may be those kind of contextual factors, may be part of why we're seeing, on balance, a greater share of letters this Congress be about oversight than hearings. And then if we want to go to the next slide, the last thing I want to talk about here is just how does oversight activity in this Congress compare to what the public thinks is important? So one, there are a number of different criteria on which we might judge the quality of congressional oversight. One of them might be whether Congress is actually looking at issues that voters think are important for Congress to be spending time on. And so what this figure does is it takes some data that's actually made available by the Policy Agendas Project that Jonathan will talk about in a minute. And the data is from the Gallup poll. And Gallup asks people what they think the most important problem facing the country is. The folks at the Policy Agendas Project have taken that data, put it into this coding scheme that they have for policy areas. And then we can, because we use the same set of policy codes, we can compare that to oversight activity. So if there were a perfect relationship between the share of all of Congress's oversight activity, all of the House's oversight activity in a particular policy area and how important the public thought that policy area was, the circles on this graph would go from the biggest circle in the upper left-hand corner to the smallest circle in the bottom right-hand corner. So the size of the circle here is based on what share of the public says an issue is the most important one facing the country. And then you can see as you, on the y-axis, the share of the House's oversight activity that falls into that category. So the policy area where the House engaged in the most oversight so far is in the government operations and ethics policy area. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone. You can see that a lot of Americans say that that's the most important problem, but there's by no means a perfect relationship. So there does seem to be some connection between what the public is saying are important issues for the House to be looking at and what the House is actually doing, but it's not a perfect relationship by any means. So next slide. So that, as I thought, was the last of my my slides. So I again thank you for having me, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A. And from there, I will turn things over to Jonathan.
Jonathan, before you go, let me just remind everybody that for those of you listening and watching, you can pose questions using either the Q&A function or the chat function, and I'll be collecting those questions for when we open up discussion after Jonathan is done and after the panelists have discussed. Thanks. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. I think this is a really great opportunity, and I've really enjoyed hearing about some of the other data that's out there and available now. I'm going to talk about a few things. First is the Policy Agendas Project, which has already been mentioned a few times, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of the background of that project and some of the data that are available, but then I'll also talk about another project that I have with a few other folks that kind of build on some of the data that Policy Agendas has collected as a way to show how other folks can use what's already there to then answer additional questions related to congressional oversight. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So again, just to give a little bit of background, the Policy Agendas Project was founded by two professors, Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones. They had been working on a big multi-year project on public policy and issue attention, and using kind of the dynamics of issue attention to understand and explain policy change. Why do we sometimes get really small incremental policy changes, and why do sometimes we get really big shifts in policy? And so that project led to their book, Agendas of Instability in American Politics, and they decided they wanted to continue working in that vein and collect additional data and really try to expand their efforts. And so the Policy Agendas Project was what came out of that initial project. As part of that, they developed an issue coding scheme that today has 20 of these major topics that Molly alluded to. And the major topics are big categories, things like energy, defense, agriculture. And then in addition to that, within each major topic, there are subtopics, more specific issues. And so today there are 220 of those, again, more specific topics, things like food inspection and safety within the agriculture major topic. And Baumgartner and Jones started with congressional hearings. That was their first kind of big data set that they really concentrated on. But the Policy Agendas project has grown, and so there are now more than 20 data sets related to US government outputs and public opinion, the most important problem data set that Molly mentioned, interest group formation, media attention, and in addition to that, it's expanded to other countries. And so there's now a comparative agendas project with 21 countries, 2 US states, Pennsylvania and Florida, and then the European Union as well. And so the website is there, comparativeagendas.net, and I believe they made the slides available. That's a clickable link in the slides. So if you click that, it'll take you right to the website. And the project's based at the University of Texas, as was mentioned earlier, which is where Dr. Jones is. So the hearings data set as of today, they have over 100,000 hearings that stretch back to 1946. And those data are collected from the Congressional Information Service. The Congressional Information Service publishes records of hearings after they happen, and they are reported as reported by the committees. So there's often a lag of a few years for when those data are made available by the committee. So similar to the issue that Molly mentioned with the letters, some committees may take a while to publish that information related to the hearings. And so there's usually a lag of a year or two, but they still have pretty current data as of just a few years ago. And there are several different aspects to the policy agenda's hearings data set that might be related to congressional oversight. They have several different variables that you can, and filters that you can apply to the data. And the broadest kind of definition of oversight would be, is this a legislative hearing or a non-legislative hearing? And so you can filter the data just for non-legislative hearings. They also have the data coded for whether a hearing is related to a proposal for a new government agency or a new program. They have hearings coded for whether a hearing is about a administration proposal, right? And both of those, we can think of different kinds of oversight of proposals for reorganizing the executive branch, or things that the executive branch wants to do. Congress is coming in and taking a closer look at that. And so there are several different kinds of these variables that could be used to track congressional oversight. And so if we move to the next slide, please. This is just an example from the website of all of the different legislative data sets that are available from lots of different countries and US states, as I said. Within the United States, they have several different data sets. The hearings are the one that I'm going to focus on today, but also bills, roll call votes, public laws, as well as the Congressional Research Service reports, right? So a few years ago, the Every CRS Report website was published. And so now all of these CRS reports are available online. And so the Policy Agendas Project has coded those according to that major topic scheme. And that's a fairly new data set that they have available now. So if we move to the next slide, I'll just show another aspect of the website is this trends tool, where you can actually graph whatever data you are interested in from any of those projects, any of those countries, any of those data sets within each country. You can compare across countries or across time like this. This is just a graph of all of the hearings that they have in their data set, legislative and non-legislative across time. And if we move to the next slide, this is where in the trends tool you would filter the kind of hearing that you're interested in. Is this a hearing related to a proposed new agency? Is this a hearing related to legislative or non-legislative activity? Is this an administration proposal, and so forth? And so once you do that, if we move to the next slide, so this is a graph of all of the non-legislative hearings over time. So we filtered out all of the hearings that have to do with bills, and this is just showing what that trend in non-legislative hearings look like across all issues. And then if we move to the next slide, this is, again, across all of those 20 major topics, hearings on proposed new agencies and programs. And so you can track trends over time going again all the way back into the 1940s. And that consistency of how those codes have been applied across time, I think, is one of the biggest advantages of the Policy Agendas project, is the fact to go back to just after World War II and get kind of a longer term view of changes to congressional oversight or other activity. So then if we move to the next slide, this is a project, again, I wanted to talk a little bit about how others can build off of the data that Policy Agendas have. This is a project that I worked on with Brian Jones and also Sean Theriault at the University of Texas to try to dig in a little deeper into the kinds of information that's coming up in hearings and different kinds of hearings that Congress is holding and any changes to that over time. How have hearings changed over time, and can we use that to understand other kind of broader dynamics in Congress today? And so we took a sample of hearings from the Policy Agendas hearings data set. We went back to 1970 for a few reasons I'm happy to talk about later, but we developed a system where we added 2 additional codes to what was already there. The first is called the purpose, which is whether they're talking about a new policy problem or just the problem itself. If the hearing deals with implementation of existing policy, or whether the hearing deals with a proposed bill or a proposed regulation that hasn't been implemented yet, but Congress wants to talk about what would the implications of this proposed bill or regulation be. And then the second variable is how are they talking about these things? Not just the committee, but within the hearing, the committee members and the witnesses that are there. Are they getting a range of opinions? Is there analysis? Is the GAO there talking about a report that they wrote? Do witnesses disagree over whether they support or oppose something? Or is every witness just giving the same point of view? And does that mean Congress then is just hearing one point of view on whatever that issue is? And so in tracking those changes over time, we found a couple of trends. One is that the number of witnesses testifying per hearing has decreased pretty dramatically. It's about half as many witnesses today are testifying at hearings compared to the 1970s. There's also been a decrease in what we call those solution hearings, the proposed bill, the proposed regulation. And so there have been increases in hearings devoted to both, policy problems that are out there, but then also implementation of existing policy. And being able to build off of that Policy Agendas data means we can also trace differences and trends across issues. And so for that witness trend that I mentioned, we're really seeing the biggest decreases in the number of witnesses called to testify in kind of sort of broadly speaking, kind of social welfare issues, education, labor, employment, agriculture. But then for those trends in the purpose of the hearing and this increase in implementation and solution-based hearings, we're finding that there's actually been an increase, or the largest increase has come in hearings related to science and technology policy, as well as defense. And so, as I said, I'm happy to talk more about either the Policy Agendas project, the hearings data set itself, or this project, but really having that consistency across time and the consistently applied coding system really allows for people to come in and use those data for their own projects in a way that makes it comparable and gives a nice consistency and reliability across time for tracking lots of different questions related to congressional oversight. And so with that, I look forward to any questions, discussion that we have.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everybody. I want to start with just a couple of general questions at first about to get the three of you talking to one another. And then we're going to entertain a series of questions. We've had some very good questions coming in from the audience. Very appreciative of the careful attention that people have been giving. But the first, and this is something that Molly sort of gestured to, you've got these three different data sets and they do different things, but at some level one could use them together. And you can imagine people both in the actual oversight space as well as the research space and others potentially drawing upon these data sets to advance their work. And so let me first pose it to the three of you. Molly, you've gone somewhat in this direction already, although you also have the most recent data, and that of the Luger Center and of the Policy Agendas Project is a bit more historical. But what would be ways of putting these kinds of databases together to examine the patterns of congressional oversight? Any thoughts on that?
I can start in part because we have done a little bit of this already, and I showed some of that analysis by where we compared the most important problem data made available by the Policy Agendas Project folks to oversight. But I think that there are a couple other ways that I could imagine doing it. And for us, a big piece of it comes with our ability to track letters. And so one thing that I think would be interesting to look at, say, comparing the hearings data that Jamie has been putting together with the folks, the Luger Center, and those grades to look at sort of how do different committees who get different kinds of grades on the hearing side, what does their letter activity look like? How many letters are they sending? That sort of thing. The other thing that sort of a little bit beyond just these three data sources, but that we really would love for people to make use of our data to do, is to look at different questions about member level behavior. So we've started to think a little bit about what this would look like, because we do have information on all of the committee and subcommittee chairs, for instance, who sign the letters. And then many of the letters that we track are also signed by other members of those committees, in addition to the chair or of the committee or the subcommittee. And so we are really curious about whether committees that are headed by chairs who are, because we're looking at a Democratic majority, who are more liberal, do those panels do different kinds or levels of oversight than others? And so that's sort of beyond just this conversation about these three data sources. But again, one of the things that we really wanted to be able to do when we developed this was to make it as useful as possible to people who wanted to answer different kinds of questions.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I want to make one quick correction that I don't think I probably communicated well enough in my presentation, which is to say that the Luger Center database is currently updated. So we're constantly updating on a weekly basis, and we'll have new hearings coming in. And kind of going along with that, I think the value of having all of these three databases together is that they do work with different timelines. Jonathan obviously has data going back to the 1970s, which is really valuable. And then Molly at Brookings has this information, with hearings and letters currently updating. And so kind of a combination of all three of these databases having these different timelines for studying oversight is really important. And then I think one thing too that's kind of unique about our database versus the other databases is that the other two are a little bit more focused on subject matter. It seems they're kind of focused on what the actual content is, and so I think that's valuable to kind of overlap onto ours, which talks really only about the oversight content that we've kind of quantified within each hearing.
Great. Jonathan, do you want to? I believe you're muted.
Sorry, I did the classic mistake.
Okay.
I would just add that at least in the congressional hearings data set, they also have the date of the hearing and as well as committee codes for which committees and subcommittees held those hearings. And so with the committee codes, I suspect they might be a little different than the committee codes that say Brookings is using. But those should be fairly easy to crosswalk, I would think. There's a committee code book that Policy Agendas provides for their codes. And so for being able to sync those up with both of the other databases that have been discussed today, should be fairly easy, I would think. And with the date, certainly for the letters or the other activity that the two databases are tracking, right, then you could use those dates to say, or to look at, are these hearings held in advance of a letter being issued, or is the letter being issued in advance of this hearing being held, as a way to kind of better get a more holistic sense of oversight activity outside of just an individual hearing. So even though, you know, the Policy Agendas project, or complementing the fact that it goes back so far, right, each unit of analysis, individual hearing, I think what's really valuable about the Luger Center data, as well as the Brookings data, is that they're kind of giving us more holistic committee level and Congress level picture of how oversight is being conducted. And so, you know, the Policy Agendas data could be used to then move from that larger picture to the granular, or vice versa.
Fantastic. So one more general kind of question to you before I begin. So before we go to the audience, and that is thinking about the relevant unit of analysis here. It can be an agenda topic, it can be a hearing, but two others that I think we want to think about a little bit are first, members, as we just discussed, about how we get some sense of how members allocate their time. This was one of the questions from the Q&A group, particularly in this age of constant congressional fundraising, things like that. If we're worried about whether in fact congressional capacity is being weakened, enfeebled by other kinds of electoral and fundraising imperatives. And the other would be agencies. And I ask in part because I know at the state level, Professor Susan Yockey at Wisconsin has an agency-based survey called the American State Administrators Project, where roughly every 4 to 6 years, they've gone and looked at a range of state level agencies and asked basically, well, from the agency standpoint, what is your experience of oversight on the receiving end? And in general, our hearing-based and Congress-based measures of oversight, while incredibly valuable, do leave that question open as to kind of what's the experience of oversight for those for whom oversight is, or those whom oversight is trying to constrain. And I just wanted to get your thoughts about ways to both use the data you have, and as this research community moves forward, to get a better sense of number one, again, how members themselves allocate scarce resources to oversight versus other activities. And two, can we get a frame on just how much oversight, if any, agencies or administrators are experiencing?
So I'll say a couple things. One is, as I said earlier, we've started to think about this a little bit, particularly at the member level. Are there certain things about members that correspond to the oversight activity that we're seeing? And again, we only have one chamber, one Congress, so we don't have the ability to leverage over time variation, but we can look kind of within the Congress across, say, subcommittees, which is the analysis that we've done on this so far. And interestingly, there are a couple of things that we've looked at where we thought we might have seen some trends, but haven't found too much so far. So one is about members' electoral security. So if you are, excuse me, the chair of a subcommittee, and you are in a more, you represent a more electorally vulnerable seat, does that affect how much oversight your subcommittee engages in? We didn't find a particularly strong relationship there. The same is true for seniority. So we compared of how long subcommittee chairs had been in the chamber with how much oversight activity their subcommittees were doing. Didn't find a lot there either. And then I mentioned before looking at ideology, and there also we didn't find a whole lot of differences, ideological differences within the Democratic Party being predictive of how much oversight activity a subcommittee was engaging in. And so for one possible takeaway, and kind of where we landed when we started to do some of this analysis, is that perhaps because of what we are studying, these questions about oversight of the executive branch specifically in this current moment by a House of Representatives controlled by one party and a president of the other party, that perhaps a lot of what's motivating the oversight we're seeing is more about kind of partisan divides and less, that's the primary driver as opposed to variation across individual subcommittee chairs. But there's more to be looked at in this area, but that's kind of where we started.
That's very useful, in part because, speaking to the political scientists out there, a lot of the models of I wouldn't say models of oversight, but models of delegation that are based on the ally principle would probably tend to emphasize ideology as much or more than party. And I think it's interesting. I mean, we need more data on this, but to the extent that those two variables or forces are differentiable in the data, which require more over time variation, things like that, that would be a really interesting question to look at. Jamie?
I was just going to say, I think one of the valuable things about our study is that you can actually go back in time for each committee and look at how oversight has been conducted through these committee chairs, through changing executives, and through changing majority parties in Congress. And so you can, kind of see this general trend where oversight does happen more often when the majority party is opposite that of the executive. But we have seen instances like in the 111th Congress in the Senate where they're performing a lot of oversight and a lot of congressional hearings. And so it's really valuable to be able to have that standard in order to, recognize where things might be changing or what trends might emerge from that.
If I can actually, since you just discussed this, Jamie, a couple questions came in. I'm just going to start feeding in some questions from the audience. A couple questions came in on how the different databases were put together and things like that. So in part because you, the Luger Center, assign different scores. One question might be, okay, do you take into account ahead of time or do you just leave it after the fact? I say that without prejudice. The fact that, divided government leads to a different kind of oversight pattern than unified government, executive and cross branch. And other questions were interested in how, in particular, at the hearing level, you put your data together without walking through all of the details. One question basically said, from what I can gather, they're scoring each committee hearing. And can you say a little bit more about what goes into that score?
Sure. Yeah. So to answer your question of, whether we take into account this divided government. Now, we obviously went in with the assumption, as Molly had mentioned in her presentation, that more oversight would occur when the majority party is different from that of the executive. But we were really committed to creating an objective way to quantify these things. So when we were looking at hearings, we weren't considering, what Congress it was happening in, or who was the executive at the time, and the data kind of emerged on its own. And then in terms of actually categorizing these hearings, I mean, we had interns, and I actually categorized a lot of them on my own. We were categorizing a lot of these by hand, and then we went to a data company called DataMade in Chicago that helped us put together our database and actually wrote a machine learning algorithm for us that was able to kind of check our work on these 20,000 hearings and have a more consistent way to check these things. And then a little bit more on how we actually took this kind of quantifiable hearing data and turned it into scores. We actually had a point value based on that chart that I brought up before. We had 3 different tiers of hearings based on their relevance to oversight. And so the top tier, the investigative oversight, got the most points, where the bottom tier got the least points. And then we added these up, and it was kind of a weighted score based on how many hearings the committee held within each category. And then we were able to compare across Congresses how oversight was conducted.
And just first for you and Molly, what's the role of subpoenas in your databases? Do you make use of that as a crucial indicator?
So I wish the answer to that question were yes. I wish that we were able to track subpoenas in a particularly rigorous or accessible way, but we could not come up with a way to do it in a something that resembled the real-time way that we were able to track hearings and letters. And so in some of the letters that we do track, there are references to subpoenas or threats of subpoenas. Some of the hearings that we track, the witnesses may have been appearing under subpoena. We talked about this a lot, and in a perfect world where there was a kind of centralized source of information on the issuance of subpoenas. I mean, to get really in the weeds, one of the challenges involves the difference between, say, a committee voting to approve the issuance of a subpoena and the actual serving of the subpoena by the House. And so we thought about this a lot, and we would have loved to include it in our tracker, but we ultimately decided that we weren't going to be able to get good enough information in a timely fashion in order to do it. But when I talk about kind of what we've learned from the 116th Congress about oversight, I talk a lot about subpoenas, and I remind people that they're an important tool, but that one thing that we've learned from watching this Congress is that their utility is limited when you have to go to the courts in order to try and enforce compliance with your subpoena, simply because it takes a lot of time to do that.
Sounds like a grant application and new project waiting in the wings. For those
don't tell my research team that I want them to collect more data, but it would be I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting questions, and when I think about the future of congressional oversight, I think a lot about questions of the utility of the subpoena going forward, especially depending on what the Supreme Court says in some of these cases that they heard last week.
Great. So a couple of other questions that are coming in from the audience, really excellent questions coming in from the audience. I want to thank everybody for waiting. So one question is, okay, all of you are interested in oversight. All of you are using hearings in one way or another. But just how sharp is the oversight, non-oversight distinction in coding hearings? This was a question asked by one person, is there gray area? Are there some hearings where we think that what we might characterize as oversight is at some level going on, even though it's not officially classified as an oversight hearing? One example would be a confirmation hearing. Yes, the person doesn't yet have the position. You might call that ex ante oversight at some level, and yet, it's one of the times when the person's information and information about the person's duties and perhaps recent behavior of the agency is being most publicly discussed. So, how rigid is that distinction? Is there room in gray? Is there room for gray area in your data? And, what do we make of this, this binarization?
So we might be coming at this from a slightly different angle from the other two organizations, and maybe even the Levin Center. But our view is that there is some, oversight content in every congressional hearing, ranging from this what we call agency conduct hearings, which are investigative. They're talking about malfeasance or failure, and then, as you said, there's also oversight content in a confirmation hearing. And so, on our scale, we give credit to every single hearing that's held because we believe that there is, some oversight content in every congressional hearing.
So just to add to that real quick, I think that there are absolutely gray areas. I mean, one of the reasons why this work is takes a lot of time and effort is to make sure that you're doing it carefully and evaluating some of these gray areas. And so for us, this is part of why we kind of settled on this approach that emphasizes key words and witnesses, and why we have more than one person review every piece of content to determine whether it falls into the category of oversight or not. And to Jamie's point, there are absolutely things that we're not considering oversight, where there may be some oversight activity going on. So one thing that we don't really look at we don't really capture in our data, but I think would be a place where some of this happens, is there are certain appropriations hearings, for instance, that I think are outside the scope of what we consider oversight, but probably have some oversight going on in them. And someone mentioned nominations as well. And so there is a gray area, but I think as scholars and as researchers, the best that we can do is sort of delineate what we are saying is oversight, and making as clear as we can what definition we're applying, and then people can make their own judgments about how to use the information that we have based on that definition.
Yeah, I think Molly makes a great point about just being clear for anyone who's studying congressional oversight, being clear about how they define oversight, and Jamie made this point too. That, I mean, even within at least the political science literature going back decades, different people who have written about congressional oversight have defined it more or less broadly. And so they kind of come up with different findings about how effective congressional oversight can be. And on that point, I would say Senator Levin and Elise Bean from Levin Center wrote an article a few years ago. It was published in the Wayne Law Review about defining congressional oversight. So I would recommend that. For the Policy Agendas projects, right, they typically just categorize a hearing as either legislative or non-legislative. And really it's whether it's a referral hearing or not. And a referral hearing is just when a bill is introduced, if a committee holds a hearing on it, is that a referral hearing? And that information, again, comes from the Congressional Information Service summary, and usually there's a bill number listed. And so if there's a bill listed, it's considered legislative. If not, it's considered non-legislative. But I think there's a lot of room within those two categories to talk about hearings that are more or less focused on oversight. And in fact, that project that I had with Brian and Sean was trying to get a little more fine-grained about that too. And so we had the two different codes, one for problem-based hearing and one for implementation, where implementation hearings are really just about how current policy is being implemented, which is pretty obviously oversight. But in the other codes, there were some gray areas, and actually it was difficult for some of the folks we had coding these to sometimes distinguish between a problem-based and an implementation-based hearing based on the information they were given. Because if a committee is holding a hearing just about, the problem of childhood obesity in the country, or the opioid epidemic or something like that, that could also be a form of oversight in trying to direct the agency's attention to this problem and say, hey, this is something that government needs to do something about. And so that itself could be a form of oversight. So it really, for whoever is doing their particular study, I think they have to make that decision about how broad of a focus or how narrow of a focus are we going to have on what we characterize as oversight. And then once that characterization is made, that's when you get the gray areas.
Sure. Kind of a related question here, and actually something I suspect, especially that the Policy Agendas project will be able to address, is over time, many folks are interested in the decline of oversight, the decline of congressional capacity. There's a cross-spectrum bipartisan conversation going on about that right now. And also about the change in norms. Now we're living in a moment right now where there's been I think it's fair to say, potentially discontinuous rupture in norms of executive legislative relations, especially under the Trump administration. But what features of your data, including yours, Molly, which is focused really on the, the very, very recent past, the present, but what features of your various data would help us to be able to measure or to get a glimpse at those changes in accommodation, changes in interbranch relation, changes in oversight, and changes in norms? And if you were to point the audience toward further research that others could do, or that you plan to do, or wish you could do to further address those kinds of things, what would they be?
So one thing I'll say is that in our data, in our web interactive that displays the information we've collected, in addition to, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but in addition to categorizing all of our content into particular policy areas, we also give each piece of content what we call an investigation tag. So for instance, you can look at all of the content related to the investigation into the whistleblower related to the Ukraine inquiry. You can look at all of the content related to investigating the Trump administration's family separation policy. So you can sort our data on the web by that as well. And so one thing someone who's interested in these questions might do to dig even deeper than we do is to pull up all of the content that we have on a particular investigation. And because, again, especially in the case of letters, we provide links to the original text of the letter, you will be able to find in one place the one source that you would need to look at this kind of back and forth of accommodation. So we don't have the letters that the executive branch sends back to Congress in response to their letters, but you can, in a lot of cases, sort of find a storyline that runs through a series of letters about this negotiation and accommodation. And so if you, this isn't a place where you might be able to do, say, quantitative analysis of the data, but if you were looking for a case study and really wanted to dig into one of these specific investigations and find out kind of what the back and forth has been, our tracker is also set up to try and help you do that.
Yeah, I think in terms of changing norms, when we started this project, we really expected to see a lot more oversight or a lot more hearings being held in the first few Congresses that we studied, and then a huge drop off in the last 6 years. But that really hasn't been the case. In the 12 years that we've studied, there hasn't been a huge drop off of congressional hearings being held. So I think maybe Jonathan's study that goes all the way back to the 1970s is a good indicator of how norms have maybe changed. I think one of the things that we were thinking about when we were trying to come up with a grading scheme was figuring out how to grade people on a scale that was feasible. And I think we learned that having this kind of 12-year baseline is an achievable goal. So if you see a chairman within the last 12 years that's held this many oversight hearings, it should be achievable for the current chairman to hold that many or more.
I actually want to start at the end with your final question about sort of directions for future research, and say that I think your question about norms is perhaps related to your earlier question about just changes in how members are spending their time. And I think it'll be important going forward to try to disaggregate or figure out, okay, what of these changes that we're seeing, what is due to some kind of change in norms, and what is just changes in the availability of time that members have and how they're spending their time, and how much of that is norms and how much of that is just a normal reaction to changes in the environment around them and other kinds of constraints. So for example, the late Senator Coburn, when he was still a senator a while ago, issued a report about how Congress was basically asking a lot more of the GAO, but not giving it as many resources, in terms of funding, in terms of staff, in order to actually accomplish all of the demands that Congress was placing on the GAO. And he actually used Policy Agenda's data in that study and cited Policy Agenda's project. But so is that increasing reliance on the GAO, is that becoming a new norm? Is that just because these other norms of committee behavior are changing and committee activity? And so trying to figure out, these things are changing. Is this because members of Congress are perceiving their jobs differently than they used to? Is it because there are these different expectations of behavior that are being placed on them or taken off of them? Or is there something else going on that is placing different demands on their time? And so, there's the norm of, conducting oversight and holding these hearings is still in place. They just don't have as many opportunities to do that. So I think that is going to be a really important question going forward, is explaining some of these changes that we've seen over time, and how much of it is because, again, the expectations are different, and how much of it is because the opportunities have changed.
Great. A couple of other questions here. We're got about 7 or 8 minutes left. But one of the questions that came up is about appropriations and how the different databases treat appropriations. And this, of course, is not merely an academic question, given the surge of stimulus spending that we've just seen, in the sense that discretionary spending, which until recently has been composing a smaller and smaller percentage of the federal budget, is now in the midst of this crisis jumping rather heavily. And so in part, this is about appropriations, but also in part about federal expenditures. What do your various databases make of appropriations? And in this moment, and it might be a more durable moment of increased federal discretionary spending, how are we going to be able to measure important developments in agenda setting and, for that matter, oversight through your data?
So like I said before, we have we've categorized every hearing in our database, and we give some value to every type of hearing. So for appropriations, we categorize those as what we call legislative hearings. And those are kind of in the mid-level category between investigative, like less than investigative oversight and greater oversight content than just an information gathering hearing. So I think it'll be important to track how those legislative hearings hopefully increase, as Congress starts to hold more hearings when they, after COVID, when they're allowed to convene. The Senate has held some hearings, but it's still lower activity than normal. So it'll be interesting to see how those, what we call legislative hearings, will change.
Yeah, I'll just say that in our data, you will find some activity by the House Appropriations Committee, and you can sort of sort the data in the web interactive to see the appropriations activity specifically. And I will just say that sort of in work that I've done beyond the scope of the oversight tracker, that the one thing that we know about the current appropriations process is that even as the process has gotten less regularized in the later stages, so even as we've seen more and more large omnibus appropriations bills, the committees tend to still hold hearings that often feature administration witnesses talking about their agency's budget requests. And so it is a really important area if you are a person who cares about oversight to be looking at. And going forward, there will be, I think, really important questions to ask, both about the continued appropriation of certain funds, and then for funds that we've already seen appropriated in this kind of big burst of immediate spending, looking at how that money has been spent, and so doing that kind of oversight as well.
And then for the policy agendas data, within each major topic code, there's a subtopic for agency appropriations. And then within, there's a government operations major topic. And within that major topic, there's a subtopic for legislative branch appropriations, and then another one for multi-agency appropriations. So it's been a long time since they did it, but there, I guess, used to be one appropriations bill for the Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education, all of which would fall under individual major topic codes. And so they get put in this multi-agency appropriations subtopic, as would any of these omnibus bills that are being passed today. And so, you know, you would be able to go into those subtopics and find those hearings. There's also a code within their data on just for appropriations hearings. And so you could sort the data or filter the data according to that variable and just see all of the appropriations related hearings within the policy agendas hearings. I would also just mention too, Stephanie Longehenig and Scott Adler at the University of Colorado Boulder have been doing some research on this reauthorization process and these kind of unauthorized appropriations that we're seeing today. And so I would definitely recommend their work for those interested in that topic.
Thanks, Jonathan. With that, I'm going to close our discussion. I just want to thank, before turning it over to Jim Townsend, the director of the Levin Center, I just want to thank these fantastic scholars for putting together this data that's going to be helpful to so many people in the coming years, and for your reflections and for taking the time today. Let me also say thanks to the Levin Center for hosting this. I'm really greatly appreciative of everything. And so let me now turn it over to Jim with the plaintiff appeal, if I may. That one question we didn't get to that's been stuck on my mind for quite some time is, are we ever going to get the OTA back? Are we ever going to get the Office of Technology Assessment back? This was one of the very first questions we got. Couldn't get to it. Apologies. Jim, answer it if you want. If you can't, oh well. We'll move on. Thanks again to everybody.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for doing such a terrific job moderating this tremendous panel. I can't thank Molly, Jamie, and Jonathan enough for the work you've done and the leadership you've shown in advancing oversight research. And we were so pleased and honored to have this opportunity to showcase your work. As far as the answer to the question about OTA, it's certainly something that the Levin Center has taken a genuine interest in, and held a meeting in Washington back in January about this very topic. A wonderful panel discussion about pulling together a couple of studies that had come out recently about technology and congressional oversight.
Yep.
And you know, we heard from Representative Takana, who sponsored legislation to reestablish OTA. So, you know, nobody has a crystal ball, certainly these days, about what might come of something like that. But I think there's certainly a lot of interest in trying to reestablish and strengthen Congress's ability to deal with technological change and to be conversant in it and to have the resources to respond to the situation. And I think there's a view that the resources, or at least they're not configured right now to do that. So I'm afraid I can't predict, but that's our sense of it right now. As far as this tremendous panel and what we've learned today, I can't by any means capture everything or try to summarize everything that was said and all the things that we learned. except to say a few things that struck me. One was certainly that what we have the beginnings of here and quite a bit of progress toward is a better understanding of some standards and norms for what oversight in Congress is. You know, how Congress conducts oversight and what kind of norms are the academia as well as the public can expect and can understand about how congressional oversight is being conducted in comparison to the past. So, you know, there's a real benefit to that, and I think a rich area for a lot of work to do in that space. I was really struck also by the contrast that Molly, you pointed out with regard to the consistency, but also some very interesting divergences between what Congress spends its time on in oversight and what the public thinks is important. I thought it was quite interesting that things like civil rights and race are things the public has a lot of concern about, but receive very, very little attention in oversight, and we don't know, whether that's a function of what that's a function of. But it's a very interesting finding, I think, nonetheless. I was very taken and interested. I know the Levin Center would be very interested in the findings that showed that things like a member of Congress's electoral security or their seniority or their ideology didn't tend to have a real impact on their oversight, on their interest in oversight, which is an encouraging sign, I would say. But of course, it begs the question, then what does drive people's interest in oversight, and how can we better understand that? So I think there's a great deal to cover there. Time is running short, but I guess I'll just say that there is a rich opportunity here for conducting more research across all of the questions that were raised and many, many more that were not. And I know we at the Levin Center are so interested and want to work with everybody on this panel, as well as the folks who participate in our oversight scholars listserv, to advance this work. And we look forward to the opportunity to do that with you in the months and years ahead of us. So with that, I will I guess call us adjourned, and thank you all again, and look forward to future opportunities to work together. I will finally say, I guess, that this session has been recorded and will be posted on the Levin Center's website, which I hope for those who either couldn't attend or want to review some of the material, we'll make sure that not only the presentation, not only this full recording, but also, of course, the slides that went along with it will be available to people. With that, thank you all, and we will be in touch with you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much.